Today we've got to talk all about the UK general election and frankly what has so far been one of the craziest campaigns I've ever witnessed. What are the polls saying, who's at risk of losing their seat, and what should you be looking out for as we head into the final stretch of the campaign? All of that is to come, but first, let's take a look at the story of how we got to this point. Well, we began 2024 with tons of speculation about when exactly the vote would be called for, and this did not let up at all over the course of the spring. Now, I offered my 2 pence about this last summer, and I predicted back then that the election would not be held in the autumn. I think Rishi Sunak will go for the election in the spring of next year, May or June 2024. I don't think he's going to wait till the autumn. There are local elections happening on the 2nd of May next year. I don't believe that Sunak will want to risk those further losses and then have a prolonged period after that leading into a general election. Because even if you get economic news that's good in January next year, people will still be feeling affected by high prices. The US election is constitutionally mandated to happen in November 2024. Does Rishi Sunak really want to have a clash, potentially, with Biden and Trump? Are you going to cancel next autumn's party conferences? So it turns out I was just only 4 days out from being absolutely spot on, which is kind of wild. But look, May or June made a lot more sense back then, but even now with hindsight, having the general election on the same day as the local elections were, the 2nd of May, would have made so much more sense. It would have meant a much bigger campaign machine behind the Conservatives, especially when it comes to local foot soldiers, the local councillors. They're the backbone of these campaigns. People like the former mayor of the West Midlands, Andy Street, may have actually held on. Had the general election been on the same day, you would have had a lot bigger turnout, and that may have just got him over the line. But look, at the end of the day, the local elections came and went, and the impression that we were all left with after that was that the general election wouldn't happen until the autumn. Even the Telegraph ran a front page splash in the days after the local elections, basically saying it's ditched its plan to hold a July vote. That had previously been reported as a possibility. But then when I saw that front page, my reaction was, well, hang on a second, was there even a plan in place for July in the first place? Because, you know, the intel that I'd had over the last couple of years, frankly, since the day that Sunak became Prime Minister, the intel always was the election would be in the autumn of 24. That's what we assumed was going to happen. Sunak came out very early at the start of 2024 saying the election will be in the second half of the year. But eventually we got to the 22nd of May. The confirmation came through with Rishi Sunak stood in the rain. The general election would happen on the 4th of July, which is technically in the second half of the year. So much has already been said about the election announcement, the rain, the playing of things can only get better in the background, and so much has happened since then. All of the gaffes on the Tory side. It has been an absolute disaster of a campaign for them, and just in general, the weirdest election campaign I've ever seen. One thing that is really interesting, though, and striking about this cycle is that the polling has barely moved, right? At least when it comes to Labour's lead over the Tories. We're still a couple of weeks out. There's still lots of time. There could still be a narrowing in the polls, but broadly speaking, Labour's lead remains at a solid 20 points. So the thing that we need to dig into today, vis-a-vis the polling, is the absolute onslaught of MRP polls that are coming out. So many of them have been released in the last few weeks, and everyone is getting enormously excited about them. But why? MRP stands for multi-level regression and post-stratification, and the reason that people obsess over these is because of the methodology. Now, electoral calculus has done a really good explainer on this. Basically, regular polls apply what's known as the uniform national swing to predict how many seats a party will win at a general election. Now, this assumes that the same change in vote share for a given party will be the same throughout the country in every single constituency. Remember the Sky News projection from the morning after the local elections, which said that Labour would win 294 seats in the next election, 32 seats short of a majority. Well, that poll applied a uniform swing to each of the parliamentary constituencies based on those local election results. Many of those seats, by the way, would have been withdrawn, given that there are new boundaries in place for this cycle. And when this poll came out, it was hugely controversial because a lot of people were saying, hang on, Labour's lead is so big, they're projected to win a majority. Why would you say that they're now predicted to get less than a majority and have a hung parliament? A lot of Tories were coming out saying that this was proof that the election was not a done deal. The poll had 242 seats for the Conservatives, so therefore the election was very much still winnable for them, and Labour has not yet won the full confidence of the public. Now, of course, we're pretty confident that that is not the case. The problem with such projections and conclusions from such projections are twofold. A, there weren't any elections in Scotland, and so these results weren't the full story, and that's where Labour is likely to do increasingly well this time. But more importantly, B, they don't take into account the local political context of each constituency, and that is where MRP comes in. So what MRP does is it works out the relationship between people's voting intention and their individual demographic characteristics like age, income, and even past voting behaviour. Then you can actually count how many of these different types of voters are in each constituency to make a prediction of how parties will perform on a seat-by-seat basis. This is a much more accurate method of polling. The YouGov MRP from 2017 was the only poll that year to predict that Theresa May would lose her parliamentary majority. Then in 2019, several MRPs correctly predicted that Boris Johnson would win an overall majority in that cycle. The YouGov MRP from that year projected that the Tories would win 359 seats, a 68-seat majority. On the night, they went on to win 365 seats, a majority of 80. That just shows you just how accurate these polls are. So, fast forward to 2024, what are the MRPs saying will happen on the 4th of July? Well, the latest YouGov MRP puts Labour on course for a majority of 200 seats. 200! In this scenario, Labour would be on 425 seats, the Tories reduced to 108, the Lib Dems would have their best showing since 2010 at 67 seats, the SNP would plummet to just 20 seats, Reform on 5, and other parties on 24. The Telegraph, Savanta and Electoral Calculus have their own MRP as well. They project the Tories will win just 53 seats. That would be a complete and utter wipeout of their support. Even worse, the Prime Minister is projected to lose his seat of Richmond and Northallerton in Yorkshire. That would be the first time ever a sitting Prime Minister has lost their seat at a general election. Now, what's notable about the Conservative numbers here, much of their decline in vote share is down to Reform UK, the party now led by Nigel Farage. Reform are only set to win 5 seats, including Farage, where he's standing in Clacton, but I think that they're going to get millions and millions in votes this cycle, and most of those will be from disgruntled Tories who have accused the party of not being conservative enough. Think back to UKIP 2015, right? This is the statistic that every single person who has studied A-level politics in the last decade will know off by heart. UKIP in 2015 won 3.8 million votes, but only ended up with 1 MP. I predict, I'm putting it on the record now, Reform UK are going to smash that number in 2024. They will get millions and millions and millions of votes this cycle, a lot more than 3.8 million, but they will still only end up with a handful of MPs because of first past the post. Their vote will not be concentrated enough to make enough gains in parliamentary seats to build up their number. It's not going to happen. Nigel Farage is talking about being the opposition to a Labour government. That's not going to happen, right? Not going to happen. The Tories will, in all likelihood, have the second largest number of seats. It could be the Lib Dems, but more likely than not, the Tories will still be the official opposition. But still, these MRP polls have produced absolutely extraordinary figures and would break all previous records for Labour since the party was founded, and this would also be the Tories' worst result in almost 200 years. And just for added context here, the highest number of seats that Tony Blair ever won was in 1997 when he won 418 seats at that election. Starmer is projected to do 7 better than that, 425 according to YouGov. So let's dig a little bit deeper into some of these numbers and have a look at who might be in the danger zone. Remember that these polls take a look at the local political context, so that makes the names we're about to go through even more striking. So, in the cabinet, as it stands, 27 cabinet ministers are standing at this election. 15 of them, according to Sky News, are set to lose their seats, including big hitters such as the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt in Surrey, Grant Shapps in Welwyn Hatfield, and Penny Mordaunt in Portsmouth. Grant Shapps and Penny Mordaunt, both considered to be future leadership contenders, both of whom could be about to lose their seats. Out of 45 ministers who are standing, 29 are set to lose their seats, according to Sky News. But notably, Labour aren't immune from any losses either. In fact, a big hitter on the Labour front bench, the Shadow Culture Secretary, Thangam Debonair, is set to lose her Bristol West constituency to the Greens, right? The Green candidate, bear in mind, happens to be their co-leader, Carla Denyer. It's looking like events in the Middle East could be the deciding factor in that race in Bristol. It'll also be playing a part in many other races up and down the country. Labour could lose quite a lot of support for it, but in Bristol West in particular, Thangam Debonair could be ousted over Labour's position on that conflict. So let's zoom out here and try and digest and make sense of all of this information, because if the polls are to be believed, and they have been very consistent so far, Labour are about to pull off an extraordinary political comeback. Frankly, this is set to be an enormous realignment of British politics. And the striking thing is, I could have easily said exactly the same thing 5 years ago with the Conservative victory in 2019, when Boris Johnson rewrote the political map with the gains that he made in red wall constituencies. Back then we thought, well, that's it. The Tories will now dominate for another decade. Labour's traditional supporter base has gone, and Starmer has got a mountain to climb. He himself even said as much. So the fact that we're now in this position where Labour are set to gain power with such an enormous swing is remarkable. It's easy to say, well, the Tories have lost this election because of Boris Johnson's Partygate saga and because of Liz Truss and the catastrophic mini budget. That's all true. You know, Rishi hasn't done himself any favours over the last few weeks and months, but this election was definitely lost by his predecessors. Even still, though, there have been MRP polls over the last few years which have shown that Tory support has been significantly eroded before either Partygate or the mini budget, and that Starmer does deserve a lot of credit for rebuilding Labour from its 2019 lows. In fact, in January 2021, just before the Conservatives' vaccine bounce in the polls, I made an entire video discussing an MRP poll which showed this. Boris Johnson would lose majority and seat if a general election was held tomorrow. The poll predicts that if a general election were held tomorrow, neither the Conservatives nor Labour would win an outright majority. Disturbingly for Boris Johnson, the survey says the Conservatives would lose 81 seats, wiping out the 80-seat majority that they won in December of 2019. Now, hold your horses for a second. Let's just take a step back for 2 seconds, because that is quite something. And as you can see from my reaction, I was thinking, wait, how can this be possible? The Tory victory was so large and decisive in 2019. How on earth could it have crumbled so quickly? And yet now look where we are. We're in a position where the Prime Minister, not Boris Johnson, as it was back then, but Rishi Sunak now, could be about to lose his own seat. Absolutely extraordinary. I am going to be honest with you though, even now, to this day, as I sit here and record this video just a couple of weeks out from polling day, I can't help but feel a little bit of scepticism that Starmer has actually managed to turn it around so quickly, and part of me says, you know what, I'll believe it when I see it on the night of the 4th of July. It just seems so extraordinary how Boris Johnson changed the political map, and for it to swing back so quickly would be utterly extraordinary. But then again, the last couple of years have been utterly extraordinary, so literally anything can happen. I do think though this is something Labour should bear in mind, because if the polls are accurate and they do win, their coalition is going to be quite broad but shallow. In many seats, Reform UK will be acting as the spoiler against the Conservatives, but over the next 4 to 5 years, if the Conservatives can manage to get their act together, some of those votes could go back to the Tories and they could build their support up. In a lot of Tory Lib Dem marginals, you know, the vote could swing back to the Tories again. And don't forget, a lot of centrist Tories will end up voting for Labour. And they're going to want to see competent leadership. They're going to want to see growth in the economy. They're going to want to see some curbs on immigration. Not like the crazy hard right folks, but they're going to want to see some progress in that area. And if Labour aren't seen to be delivering on those promises, many folks could end up deserting them quite quickly. Labour are going to have to hit the ground running and demonstrate that they are actually making a tangible difference to people's lives, because I've got a sneaky suspicion the honeymoon period for this incoming Labour government, should the polls be right, could be very, very short, especially once the British press gets involved. Final thing for today. Let's wrap up with the things that you should keep an eye out for as we enter the final stretch of the campaign. First things first, we have to ask a very important question. Who will the Sun newspaper endorse at this general election? If you have been paying attention to the Sun's front pages over the last few months, you'll notice that they have been very light on political coverage, and the onslaught of attacks that they used to put out against Starmer have now subsided. So could that mean that the Sun is about to endorse Sir Keir Starmer? Could they be about to do the unthinkable? I tell you, it sure does look like it, although my guess will be that in any such endorsement, you'd get a half-hearted approach. The Sun will just say, the country's in a mess, people are crying out for leadership, let's give Keir a chance. But it won't be, we absolutely endorse everything that Sir Keir Starmer stands for, let's get behind him and rally round. That is going to be a huge moment in the campaign. Don't underestimate the importance of such an endorsement by the Sun. I know readership is down, but bear in mind, the Sun newspaper loves to back a winner, and their readers will pay attention, so keep an eye out for that. That is going to be huge. The other thing to keep an eye out for, and this is more of a health warning, is to please ignore any mention of the word supermajority by Conservatives who are trying to scare voters away from voting reform and trying to encourage those on the left to vote against Labour to try and somehow rein in their potential majority. This all started with the Defence Secretary Grant Shapps, who warned voters that such a scenario would give Labour, quote, unchecked power, and as a result would be, quote, a dangerous place to put the country. I mean, this is all completely outrageous, absolute nonsense. Let me make absolutely clear to everyone watching. There is no such thing as a supermajority in the Westminster political system. It doesn't exist. There is no such concept whatsoever. Our electoral system, in fact, our system of government as a whole, is predicated on parties winning big majorities in the House of Commons. Parties are supposed to win strong majorities because they govern with the confidence of a majority of MPs. That is how the system works. Practically speaking, the notion of a supermajority is completely redundant because our system only requires a simple majority of MPs to vote for a measure for it to pass. The only thing I can think of where a supermajority of MPs were needed to pass something was with the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. You needed 2/3 of MPs to agree to call an early general election. That's what happened in 2017. But then 2 years later, only a simple majority of MPs were needed to pass legislation overriding the Fixed Term Parliaments Act in order to hold the snap general election of December 2019. So look, don't be fooled by this hyperbolic rhetoric. The Tories themselves have governed with a large majority since 2019. That is how the system is supposed to work. That is normal. This is clearly an admission by Grant Shapps that the Tories appear to be heading for defeat. So the party is now undergoing a mitigation strategy here. They're trying to stem their losses by scaring people, especially those on the right, that a vote for reform is not just a vote against the Tories, but it will also lead to a calamitous pseudo-dictatorship by Labour. Completely ridiculous. Final thing, the second head-to-head debate between Sir Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. It's happening on the BBC on the 26th of June, moderated by Michelle Hussein. She did the 7-way debate on the BBC a couple of weeks ago. The really good thing about this debate is that they've extended its duration by 15 minutes. It was going to be an hour, now it's going to be an hour and 15 minutes, which is definitely good news. The ITV debate, which happened at the start of June, was just way too short. Way too short. I wished that this BBC one was 90 minutes, would have been better, but hour and 15 minutes, no commercial breaks, you can't complain. Hopefully Starmer and Sunak won't have the criminally short 45-second answers. I mean, that was just way too short. Things to look out for in this debate: continued Tory attacks on Labour's tax plans. I think had it not been for Sunak's D-Day blunder, this £2,000 made-up figure would have cut through a lot more than it did. However, I will say Labour have had to answer a lot more questions on it than I suspect they would have liked, so expect Sunak to continue to press Starmer on that. We can expect Keir Starmer to continue his general approach of being very cautious, not saying too much, although he may decide to go after the PM around allegations that people around the Prime Minister were betting on the day of the general election. I'm not going to say any more on that because it's now under investigation. That is just absolutely incredible. So I definitely expect Starmer to attack the Prime Minister on that front. But overall, Starmer didn't say very much in the first debate. Expect the same this time around, but you can't really blame him. He's 20 points ahead in the polls. So simply put, the less that he says, the better. Woo!